Hello. Hello from a secluded location in downtown Seattle. Welcome to the 26th Annual Northwest Jewelry and Metal Symposium. Pardon me, I have things written down. I want to make sure I get all this right. There's a lot of stuff. Way back in March, we decided for the second year to stream this year's symposium, which is why we're sitting screen to screen as opposed to us apart from each other in a lecture hall. And it was a tough decision to make that choice, especially so early in the year. But of course, it was the right one. We hope to be able to have a more in-person experience soon and maybe even create a hybrid of some sort, which I think would be really, really wonderful. Along with the challenges presented in streaming the symposium, there's also been some great opportunities, like the dress rehearsals. Andy Fallett, our tech magician and streaming spirit animal, schedules a dry run with each presenter to work out the bugs and get everybody on the same virtual page, which we just were doing just a moment ago. These rehearsals allow the symposium planning committee to get an early look at each presentation to make sure that it's going to work right. Now, I've watched them all, and I can honestly say that you are in for a remarkable day. Now, for those who've seen me before, you know every year I say the same thing, but this is the year that I really, really mean it. Okay, so who is the Symposium Planning Committee? I'm glad you asked. Symposium Planning Committee is Molly Epstein, Andy Fallett, Leah Gerard, Kirk Lang, Mickey Lippy, our chairperson, Lynn Vandenberg, and me, Andy Cooperman. Before we get any further, I'd like to share our First Nations land acknowledgement. Here we go. In the pursuit of historic truth and the desire for deeper understanding, the Seattle Metals Guild and the Symposium Planning Committee acknowledge that the work of the Seattle area creative community takes place on the traditional lands of the Northwest Indigenous peoples. We have been using this land for generations as uninvited guests of the coastal Salish, Suquamish, and Duwamish people. It is with respect for these people that we honor their history and this truth. Okay, we have five presentations today, followed by an after party and panelist Q&A. Now, we built time into each presentation for questions, and we will get to as many as we can. If you have a question, just type it into the Q&A feature, which you can click on at the bottom of the screen toward the right on most devices, like my MacBook. Please try to keep the questions as brief and concise as you can so we can get to as many questions as we can. All questions will be held until the end of the presentation, and they'll be read by me. Now, if we run a little short of time for questions during the 50-minute slot, we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can during the after party. The after party and panelist Q&A is a chance for our presenters to interact with each other, which is super sweet, to answer some more questions, and for all of us to continue the conversation in a more casual space. Now, you can bring a beverage, you can take off your pants, put them back on if that's where we are in this, and you can relax and just kind of debrief and decompress. We are also proud to announce that Spotlight, our newest feature now in its second year, is available throughout the symposium. Spotlight presentations are short, artist-made videos showcasing the work and creative lives of makers that you may not be familiar with. We have 4 Spotlight presentations to share this year. The lunch break is really an ideal time to watch these presentations. And finally, there's the silent auction. It's a little small this year, but all the items have been lovingly curated and are up for bid through tomorrow night. You can find the link to the auction on the symposium webpage. The auction opened about 8 hours ago at 12:15 this morning, and will close in about 39 hours from now. I did the math this morning at 11:45 p.m. Sunday. All times are Pacific Standard Time. Okay, here's how it all works. Today is divided into 6 individual webinars. You will find the Zoom webinar links in the email that has been sent to you with your registration. You are in the first webinar right now, and you can just stay put for our first presentation. You'll have to sign into the second webinar for the second presentation, and so forth. The last webinar will be the after party and Q&A. It's crucial that you sign into each individual webinar. Each new presentation webinar will begin at the top of the hour. You can sign in at any time during a presentation. The entire symposium will be recorded and available to those who registered through the end of October, beginning in the days following the symposium. Now, I know that sounds a little mushy, but it's the best we can do right now. Just keep checking back and you'll see if it's up or not. Nothing really to do with us. You know, it seems like only a few weeks ago we were sitting in this same space, rolling out last year's symposium, but it's been a year of stuff. And in that time, our Northwest Arts and Metals community has lost 4 friends and colleagues. Anne Bridjakovsky was a quiet woman with a really ready smile and a love for craft, especially chasing and repoussé. It was as an MFA student at the University of Washington that Anne discovered Chaser's pitch, or rather how sticky, messy, and unpleasant standard pitch could be. This led her to develop her own line of resin-based pitches, pine resin-based pitches. Look at that, beautiful stuff. And this eventually grew into Northwest Pitchworks. Metalsmiths across the Northwest, the United States, and the globe still use and love her pitch. In fact, Northwest Pitchworks is still in business. Frances Smirsch, here's some of her early work. Really, really sweet, if you can see that. Frances Smirsch was a painter, a jeweler, and a metalsmith, and a friend. She died this summer of early onset dementia. She was only 54 years old. In the late 90s, Frances took a workshop with Jim Cotter here in Seattle, which introduced her to hybridized concrete and changed the course of her career. I was in that workshop and I saw the light bulbs go off. She launched a beautiful and successful line of jewelry she called Concrete and Pearls, which sold around the world. As Frances said, real girls wear concrete and pearls. Frances also developed a line of powder-coated steel jewelry. Get a look at that, like these earrings. While selling at the big wholesale and trade shows, Frances and her husband, John, became experts at recognizing the newest, best, and most exciting work from makers showing at other booths. They began to curate selections of art, jewelry, and homewares that became Click, Design That Fits, a retail storefront in the neighborhood of West Seattle, just west of us. Click became, and still is, both a bricks and mortar and a clicks and order, I didn't make that part up, destination for anyone who is looking for something innovative, unique, and beautifully made. Frances was a good friend and an inspiration. Todd Hughes, here is a really fabulous, one of the last things he made. This ring is fabricated in stainless and garnet. It's hollow stainless, really beautiful. He was a very close friend. He also passed this summer and also at age 54. He's one of the most recent, I just showed you one of the most recent pieces, sorry about that. Our good friend and former Seattle Metals Guild president, Dana Casera, recorded these thoughts.
As an active member of the Seattle Metals Guild, I have been fortunate to meet and work with many members of our community. Todd Hughes was among them. Whether or not you knew him personally, as a guild member, he touched your life. Todd passed away August 1st, 2021, of complications from colon cancer at the bitterly young age of 54. Todd was an award-winning graphic designer who donated countless hours to the Seattle Metals Guild. He established the look and the feel of the organization in the mid-2000s when he took over the layout and design of the Guild newsletter. All those beautiful postcards we used to mail for the lecture series and the symposium, he designed them. He was an incredibly committed volunteer. As president of the Guild, I often called upon him for help. He was always available. In 2014, I was able to recognize his contributions by awarding him with the Presidential Award for Outstanding Volunteerism. It was an honor. Todd had a keen eye for detail.
Hey everybody, I'm back just for a quick second. I believe we're having a little trouble with the Dana Casera sound on the video, so we're starting it over. And Andy, let her rip.
As an active member of the Seattle Metals Guild, I have been fortunate to meet and work with many members of our community. Todd Hughes was among them. Whether or not you knew him personally, as a guild member, he touched your life. Todd passed away August 1st, 2021, of complications from colon cancer at the bitterly young age of 54. Todd was an award-winning graphic designer who donated countless hours to the Seattle Metals Guild. He He established the look and the feel of the organization in the mid-2000s when he took over the layout and design of the Guild newsletter. All those beautiful postcards we used to mail for the lecture series and the symposium, he designed them. He was an incredibly committed volunteer. As president of the Guild, I often called upon him for help. He was always available. In 2014, I was able to recognize his contributions by awarding him with the Presidential Award for Outstanding Volunteerism. It was an honor. Todd had a keen eye for details. This is evident in his graphic design as well as his sublime jewelry work. He was a deeply curious jeweler and metalsmith, eager to explore every technique and tool. Although his artistic pursuit in jewelry always played second fiddle to his graphic design career, his jewelry never suffered. Each piece was carefully planned and exquisitely executed. Those of us who are fortunate enough to own one will treasure it forever. Todd was a tall, lanky, unassuming face in the crowd. If you knew him, you knew he had a quick sense of humor and a very generous spirit. He was the quintessential good guy. He was a great friend. We were lucky to have him in our community, and he will be very deeply missed.
Yeah, that was a little choppy, I know, and the sound was a little off. I couldn't be sorrier for that, and it was nothing on our end, just the vagaries of streaming. So we're going to try to get it together, and we'll either run it through lunch, we'll run that again through lunch, or we'll squeeze it in at some point during the day. So I really appreciate your patience, and let's move on to the next little bit. Finally, Nancy Worden, an internationally recognized artist and maker, passed away early in 2021, in February. Nancy's work can be considered emblematic of Northwest jewelry, especially what's become known as Ellensburg funk. Doran Meinhardt built this presentation, and we'll swing it over to that right now.
Good morning, SMG. My name is Doran Meinhardt, and I am honored to present this loving tribute to our friend Nancy Worden. I was a high school jewelry teacher when I first met Nancy. She enriched my life by showing what an adventure making and teaching jewelry could be. In a Facebook post, a friend writes, Nancy was a local and national treasure for contemporary jewelry. She was talented, inspirational, and generous with her knowledge. She was such a force of nature, intensely dedicated to her field and to her art. Nancy created thoughtful and powerful pieces of narrative metal art. Using found objects in gripping and surprising ways, she had a unique ability of turning pain into art. She would always start out with the idea or story of the piece, and then select and artfully assemble the found objects that would articulate her vision. In her necklace, Buying Time, Nancy illustrates her attachment to her dying mother with egg timers and oxygen tubes, serving as the ventilators to buy her mom just a little bit more time. Terminology is a necklace Nancy created, which deals with the misunderstanding resulting from careless speech. Here are stamped politically correct and rude forms of various words. I have never seen a Selectric typewriter ball look so beautiful. Nancy's artworks were powerful, funny, but sometimes painful revealers of human truths. Her family reunion necklace hangs in the Smithsonian. It started out with a box of old family photographs with her grandmother's comments written on the back of each one, answering the question, what's the real story behind all those smiling faces? After the war, Fred just kind of wondered. In her art, Nancy would tell her own story, but also invite the viewer to find his or her own story in the piece. My job, she would say, is to start the conversation. Dead or Alive combines resin bear claws, fur scraps, glass fish eyes, bullet casings, dimes, and a camera lens, echoing Native American grizzly bear claw necklaces. The camera lens at the center is a metaphor about the human need to kill and take souvenir from a wild creature. Dead or Alive also refers to Princess Diana, who was killed in a paparazzi chase while Nancy was making this necklace. Diana's picture is set into the back of the centerpiece camera lens. Armed and dangerous. Nancy boldly and unapologetically would take on controversial subjects in her art. Black onyx set into rifle shells, malachite, a silver cross, and shredded money make a powerful statement suggesting that fear and anxiety can sometimes give religion an evil power over people's lives. In hologram theater, Nancy Worden shows and warns us what a modern day slave bracelet would look like using credit cards, the modern day form of economic enslavement. What is dazzling to me about Nancy Worden's artwork is her willingness to use and to transform just about anything to tell a story. In Mixed Messages, a brooch which explores the real meaning of people's words, we find candy, plastic dice, eyeglass lens, and a pebble. And now we'll include a cast lifesaver and a condom in Nancy's list of surprising found objects used to tell a story. Her knight in shining armor uses both humor and wisdom as she cautions young people while looking for a guy, do not expect to find a knight in shining armor to rescue you. It is much more realistic to hope for a nice guy wearing a condom. In Bathroom Blues, Nancy ingeniously and artistically uses such mundane objects as a toilet brush and a pink sponge to tell the age-old story about whose turn it is to clean the bathroom. Nancy threw many epic parties in her lifetime. For her 40th birthday, she staged a full-blown prom. This brooch commemorates that event. The issue of conflict resolution often appears in Nancy's work. In Repairing the Nest, Nancy uses circular composition of electroformed branches. And while they appear elegant, the branch-like forms address stressful conflicts which can arise between couples during a house remodel and suggest the idea of reconstructing a relationship. A brigandine is a metal undershirt worn during medieval wars when soldiers were primarily on foot. This work was inspired by reports of soldiers in Iraq who were picking up scrap on street to reinforce their Humvees. This piece of Nancy Worden designed armor is strengthened by coins and by mesh. The brigandine is for Ishtar because she is the goddess of war and for the young women soldiers fighting the war in Iraq. A woman who wore this piece said that she thought of Joan of Arc, still remembered for her single-mindedness and her courage. Another formidable piece of artistic armor created by Nancy is literal defense. I always think of Nancy as a fighter and as an advocate for causes she passionately believed in, such as art education. The words stamped in metal support the idea of art education for all students in schools. ALS, the elephant in the room. All of us have our checkout date. In 2009, Nancy was diagnosed with ALS, a killer disease in her family. Preceded in death by her grandmother, her great aunt, her mother, her younger sister, all of ALS, Nancy lived her life with an urgent I'm not playing attitude. She understood and she knew the inevitable. She had a limited amount of time. She pushed the gas pedal hard. Her body dwindled down. She knew she wasn't going to have enough time to achieve all the things in front of her. Her sculpture, "The Patient is at the Bottom of the Food Chain," appeared in the 2016 biennial at BAM. It is dedicated to the memory of her family members who perished from ALS. Here's a close-up of the names and pictures of Nancy's great aunt and younger sister. The sculpture makes a statement of how, in monies for medical research, the patient is always the last to receive the funds. The patient is at the bottom of the food chain attracted the attention of the medical community, resulting in Nancy participating in a study involving experimental treatments to find a cure for the disease. Always the advocate and fighter for change, Nancy participated in this research until months before her death. Vote early, honk and wave. This is the last time Nancy and I were together. We are in front of her house with the Statue of Liberty and assorted young and old neighbors urging people to vote early. I am personally very happy that Nancy lived to see the true president-elect sworn into office. Nancy was always a fighter for causes she believed in. I will love and remember my friend as a confident, hard-driving, task-oriented, unstoppable force who created amazing works of art, who curated jewelry shows, who wrote books, who promoted youth art by going out to teachers' classrooms, inviting them to passing the torch, who urged museums to have jewelry shows and metal art in their permanent collections. Nancy was a tireless advocate for her field. She was working on pieces until a few months before her death. I picture Nancy riding a powerful horse into battle, dodging repeated gunfire and arrows. She falls off this horse many times, but gets back on again and again. In her last Christmas letter, 2019, she wrote, "Let's be positive this year and find something to celebrate every day. After 47 years of amazing stuff, I am still at it. Love, Nancy." This book is an invaluable resource about the life and work of Nancy Worden. It was published in 2009, the same year that Metallurgy was celebrated in Tacoma and that Nancy had a retrospective show at the TAM. It can be purchased at Barnes & Noble. Thank you very much for your attention today.
Wow, that was really fantastic, Noreen. We had few little glitches during it, but it's funny. I've known Nancy a long time, and I learned quite a bit from that. It's really nice to kind of see that all in one place. I do apologize for any technical glitches. We do really work hard to make sure that doesn't happen, but given the vagaries of the airwaves, it happens. At any rate, Nancy is really the perfect segue into our first speaker of the day, Cindi Strauss. Cindi Strauss is the Sarah and Bill Morgan Curator of Decorative Arts, Craft, and Design with a specialty in contemporary jewelry at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. She is also the Assistant Director of Programming and has been with the museum since 1994. Cindi holds a bachelor's degree in art history from Hamilton College and a master's degree in the history of decorative arts from Cooper Hewitt Parsons School of Design. She is co-author, along with Susan Cummins and Damien Skinner, of the recently published book, Influx, American Jewelry and the Counterculture. It is a great read. As you can see, I actually own it. Here's Cindi.
Thank you so much, Andy, and thank you to the Metal Arts Guild of Seattle for inviting me to participate in today's exciting symposium. I'm going to dive right in and share my screen. Okay. So as Andy said, I am going to be talking today about research that came out of the book that Damien Skinner and Susan Cummins and I co-authored Influx, American Jewelry and the Counterculture. This project began with separate conversations that Susan and I were having, and then Damien and Susan were having, about thinking through what is American about American jewelry, what sets it apart from jewelry being made elsewhere. And we quickly determined that narrative work from the historical period of the 1960s and 1970s was a type, a genre of jewelry making that was only happening in America. And this very fertile period of creativity came naturally. The field was being established, university programs across the United States were cropping up. It was a hugely exciting time to be in jewelry. It was also an incredibly turbulent time for the United States. And so this project became an opportunity to show how jewelry artists responded to the issues of the day. One of our goals was to tell an additional under-researched story about American jewelry's history, featuring well-known artists as well as artists that have been lost to history. It also gave us an opportunity to recontextualize artists that are well known for us. We conducted a large amount of artist interviews, did archival research, institutional research in the almost 5-year process of from idea to the actual publication of this book. So my lecture today will introduce you to the key artists and themes explored in the book, demonstrating the importance of Pacific Northwest jewelers to this history and contextualizing them with other American jewelers working in a similar vein. Our project began as a monograph on Fred Wohl, who was based in Maine and was one of the most important American jewelers, not only of this early period, but throughout jewelry history. Damien, Susan, and I went to his studio in Deer Island, Maine, looked through his archives, and met with his widow, Pat Wheeler. And it became clear to us that the ideas that Wohl put forth in his work, whether it was political commentary, environmental commentary, dealing with branding and American consumerism, coupled with his counterculture life. While he did not look like a counterculture figure, he drove a VW bus, ate food from health stores, and was involved with a tremendous amount of causes. These ideals were shared by a larger group of American jewelers, especially ones located in the Pacific Northwest during this period. And we can see Wohl as being one of the great connectors in this history through his teaching, through his work at Haystack, his participation in Somerville, his lectures and demonstrations across the country, and his role as a juror also in many invitationals and exhibitions across the country. Wohl's use of found objects and assemblage, his development of a style that included geometric or sectioned compositions, and the scale of his work was shared by many Pacific Northwest artists working in this vein. He used recognizable symbols, and so his narratives were clearly understood. I'm showing you right now one of his most famous pieces that you're probably familiar with, Come Alive, You're in the Pepsi Generation, a brooch from 1966. This was a breakthrough work for Fred Wohl. He always listened to the radio in his studio, most often to NPR, and he heard the Pepsi jingle that was made during that time on the radio while he was working, and this inspired the brooch. The image that you see of the smiling young woman was one of the Peyton Place actresses, a very popular sitcom from that day. And she seemed to embody the new way of living that Pepsi spoke of in the jingle. And this, of course, was in opposition to what was happening in the Vietnam War and other ills in terms of societal, everything that was happening in society during that time. And this was the work, as I said, it was a breakthrough that allowed him to move past the jewelry conventions of his education. In developing the list of artists to examine for this book, we looked hard at artists who were important in the Pacific Northwest story during the 1960s, including artists like Ruth Pennington and Russell Day. We also, of course, looked at Ramona Solberg for her connections to many artists working with found objects and narrative themes, as well as for her own championing of Native American and non-Western cultures in her own work. Solberg, like other artists included in this book, provided context and important historical connections to the book's themes, even though they were not necessarily making jewelry that specifically fit our main thesis. And so this is an important part of the narrative that we constructed in the Influx book. Our book acknowledges that history is expansive. And while we needed to draw lines in order to complete the project and meet our deadlines, we really tried to make the tent large enough to bring attention to other important voices. Don Tompkins, of course, one of the most significant jewelry artists working in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Solberg taught at Central Washington State in Ellensburg, and she was responsible for bringing Don Tompkins back from New York to teach there in 1966. Tompkins was well known to us already, and we had signaled that he was going to be an important artist for the book. By the mid-1960s, he had already developed his signature assemblage style, not unlike Fred Wall's, and began making work that addressed his feelings on the topics of the day. These topics were amongst those central to the larger themes of politics and funk that our book explores. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the main characters in our book right now. Ken Corey, of course, we can't have a conversation about jewelry in the Pacific Northwest without talking about Ken Corey, iconoclast, teacher, counterculture participant, inspirational artist. He was educated at Washington State University and then the California College of Arts and Crafts, and then went back to Washington State. Corey takes over for Don Tompkins in his position at Central, teaching jewelry and metalsmithing at Central Washington State in Ellensburg in 1972. He was steeped in the funk aesthetic and assemblage and had a totally rebellious attitude towards the arts. Corey's jewelry ranged from the humorous to the serious in message. A keen collector of Native American jewelry and beadwork, he assigned his students a project each year in which they were to make a piece of jewelry based on a Native American form. Here you're seeing his own squash blossom necklace from 1974, in which he appropriated the Hopi form. 22 caliber shelves, light bulbs, and a cast pencil that speaks to the Pencil Brothers, who we'll talk about in a moment, show Corey's use of found objects and use of funk to create narratives that express his opinion about cultural issues of the day. And speaking about the Pencil Brothers, here you see an image of Les Lapierre, the artist who meets Ken Corey in 1966 at Washington State University. Their first collaboration was in 1969, naming themselves the Art Team. They were looking for a model of shared creativity that would represent how they wanted to collaborate with each other. In 1972, they changed their name to the Pencil Brothers. Lapierre had been drawing cartoons under the name Pencil, and Corey said that Lapierre was lead and he was red, i.e. better red than lead. Their works were geographically balanced. You often had a frame with an internal picture. There was a balance between male, female, geometric, and organic shapes, etc. They celebrated consumer culture with puns, provocative narratives and images, irreverence, and sex. Don Tompkins' younger sister, Marilee, was also a central figure during this period. She first studied at the University of Washington in Seattle, but when her brother Don began teaching at Central Washington State, she transferred there and studied with him from 1967 to 69. A free spirit, she embraced the funk aesthetic using found objects to create narrative works that often featured people she knew, as well as social commentary. After she moved to Seattle in 1972, she met Ken Corey through Les Lapierre. Friends and lovers for over 20 years, they took road trips, they camped, they trolled flea markets, and generally had, by all accounts, an amazing time together. You can see Marilee Tompkins' style here embodied in the necklace that she created, and 1975 featuring Ken Corey. One of the things that connected a lot of the artists that we were looking at in our book was their lifestyle, the craftsman's lifestyle, and particularly the counterculture in the 60s and 70s. Many of these artists were looking to find ways to introduce their work to the larger public through invitational exhibitions. Seattle, of course, was so lucky to have the Jim Manalides Gallery, which showed, in addition to other art forms, jewelry by Ken Corey, Les Lapierre, and Marilee Tompkins, among other artists. Like all areas in the United States, the Northwest had its own flavor of lifestyle characteristics, but also craftspeople here, as well as elsewhere, relied on fairs. You see an image of the Bellevue Crafts Fair from 1947 that existed for many years. And also some help from the American Craft Council in terms of regional fairs and regional exhibitions. Andy mentioned Jim Cotter early on, and Cotter is a very important figure for our narrative, both as an artist, but also as a co-founder of Somervale. He was not a member of SNAG or the American Craft Council, traits that many of the artists that we explored shared. Instead, he was a leader of the jewelry counterculture community. His own path to becoming a jeweler was circuitous. He, like many other artists, made commercial jewelry to pay the bills while simultaneously having a studio jewelry practice. His studio jewelry consisted of anti-war, many anti-Nixon pieces, as well as those that used American tropes to satirize commercialism. And here you can see his impeachment with honor belt buckle from 1974, Goofy he's using as a stand-in for Nixon, and one of his series of McDonald's brooches in which he used the Golden Arches or Ronald McDonald, and a series of brooches that really satirized consumerism, branding, and its hold over the American people. Not surprisingly, Cotter was served with a cease and desist letter from McDonald's Corporation. So if anyone ever finds one of these brooches, let me know or let Jim know, because we would love to be able to reclaim some of them. He doesn't know where any of them are. As I mentioned, Cotter was a co-founder of Somervale, which really for jewelry and metalsmithing can be considered the anti-SNAG. It was established in 1971 in Vail, Colorado. People referred to it as counterculture camp, and it taught art in many, many media, as well as had its own art criticism program. For jewelry and metalsmithing, in addition to the classes that were taught, there was a 3-day metal symposium. This community for counterculture-minded jewelry artists allowed them to come to Vail, Colorado, be outside, live in nature, share and debate conversation and ideas about topics of the day. And participants really include a who's who of jewelry artists, ranging from Fred Wall and Ken Corey and Marilee Tompkins to Bob Ebbendorf, Lane Coulter, Barry Merritt, Jan Brooks, Eleanor Moti, Jamie Bennett, and many, many more. They had a lot of fun in addition to working hard. And here you can see an image from their famous saw file solder contest, in which they had teams of 3 who competed doing each one of these techniques to create a ring. And this was just one of the many fun activities. But places like Somerville, as opposed to the SNAG conferences where jewelry artists also gathered, Somerville was really the place where a lot of jewelry artists who were left-leaning discussed the important issues of the day and talked about ways in which they were making work that referenced that. All of the artists that are featured in our book were political. Some were anti-war, some were anti-Nixon, others were feminists or environmentalists. And the book delves into their political narratives, framing their pieces with the historical events or people that inspired them. And in this next section, I'm going to show you how the Pacific Northwest jewelers were contextualized with other artists who were responding to the same triggering issues. Don Tompkins, most famous for his commemorative medal series from the late 1960s and early 1970s, which celebrated and satirized public figures in government and pop culture. These necklaces became a vehicle for his social, political, and cultural commentary. Here in Nixon Bringing Us Together from around 1970, you see how Tompkins has used text, newspaper, found and made objects to address the Kent State massacre. The imagery, as we have shown you here, was drawn specifically from a famous photograph that John Philo took and which was published in newspapers across the country. And you can see how Tompkins clipped it and made it a medallion. He is using Mickey as many artists used Disney characters as stand-ins for Nixon, as we saw with Jim Carter. Instead of bringing people together at the happiest place on earth, i.e. Disney, in this brooch, Mickey as Nixon is uniting people through grief. Bruce Metcalf, who was working on the East Coast at this time, also made a work that responded to the Kent State massacre. He was at Syracuse University doing model making, writing cartoons for the school newspaper, and taking classes in the architecture school. This is his response to the attack that the National Guard soldiers had on protests at Kent State. You're seeing the red worms here as the enemy, i.e. students protesting the Vietnam War. The soldiers have caricatures of their, their faces, their eyes are bugging out. The worms have aggressive mouths, and you can see the conflict here. In fact, Metcalf employs satire, I would say, in a different way than Tompkins did, which was a much more kind of straightforward narrative. Here, Metcalf is saying that worms are rotten to the core, i.e. destabilizing American values. And here they're invading a traditional New England village, which shows rot in the body politic. Richard Maudsley, who was based in the middle of the country, never defined himself and still does not define himself today as being counterculture, but he was anti-war. He did not protest himself or particularly lead a counterculture lifestyle, but he did make work, including a war protest series from 1970 to 1971. Rather than using found objects like many of the artists working in this vein did, Maudsley hand cut and fabricated individual metal pieces. And you can see here how intricate his compositions became. This sets him apart from a lot of the other artists that are working today, or working during that period. With Tank on the right, You can see here how he has placed Nixon's head at the top in an anti-war statement. And with camera from 1971 on the left, he is creating a narrative about the role of journalists in covering the Vietnam War and the role of boosterism and America through the use of the eagle symbol. Fred Wall, of course, was known for his satirical portraits of figures like Nixon, and you can see Noxon here on the left-hand side. The title was based on a Nixon bumper sticker that Wall saw upside down in the gutter one day. He has his peephole eyes so that you can see through Tricky Dick, as he was known. And you can probably, if you look closely at the surface, see how he has embedded newspaper clippings about the Vietnam War and the lack of support for desegregation in the South. They're integrated into that epoxy surface. And he also has flag-like star-spangled teeth. On the flip side, Wool also made some deadly serious, sober, elegiac pieces, such as November 22nd, 1963, which of course is the date of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Here you quite clearly see Kennedy's photo in a way, placed in a way that is reverent, in the center, framed. A single star is on top of the frame, denoting the Texas Lone Star State, and a single shell casing dangles below. Ken Corey and the Pencil Brothers rarely used explicit references to political events or figures in their work, but sometimes they snuck things in. You can see Corey's portrait of Chairman Mao here on the left. In terms of the collaboration with the Pencil Brothers, Les Lapierre described what they did as providing satirical commentary, provocation, and a celebration of individuality within the counterculture. Quote, "That was the political statement. No matter which philosophy or religion or political party or aesthetic party you believe in, we have the right to make fun of it." And indeed, they did make fun of it. And here you see with Egypt, the wall piece, as they said, or Lapierre said, they inserted various symbols that would irritate people, no matter what faction they belonged to. As part of our research, we looked into and rediscovered Barry Merritt, who was based in Rochester, New York, who was actively involved with SNAG. He had gone to the School of American Craftsmen. And I discovered a very interesting letter to the editor that he wrote for Goldsmith's Journal, which was previous Metalsmith magazine. So it was the publication of SNAG, in which he and his partner at the gallery wrote an impassioned letter saying that SNAG and its artists should support the National Organization of Women. His work, as we dove deeper into it, really addressed a lot of the narratives and issues that we were uncovering for this book. He too did medals and badges like Don Tompkins, though his featured, as you can see here with Buffalo Bill, symbols and images that were a nod to gentler times as opposed to the satire and open criticism that Don Tompkins' work often featured. But Barry Merritt, like a number of other artists from that period, looked to Wonder Woman, a significant figure from the comics, also one who would be enacted by Linda Carter in the TV series and gone on now today, of course, to movies. This work, Wonder Woman, that you're seeing here, was based on a 1972 cover of Ms. Magazine that was titled Wonder Woman for President. Wonder Woman was seen as a feminist symbol of peace and very much an anti-war figure. And so numerous artists, including Merritt and Richard Maudsley and others, used Wonder Woman as a vehicle for their views. We also aimed to look at artists from the African-American community who were working at that time. And Evangeline Montgomery was one of the most significant. She was trained at California College of the Arts and Crafts in the late 1960s. And between 1968 and 1974, she curated 8 exhibitions of established and emerging African-American artists. Her own work in metals included jewelry and metal reliquary boxes, such as the 2 that I am showing you here, which she created to connect to important African Americans, and they look directly at African history. Justice for Angela, which you're seeing on the left, is about the Black Panther Angela Davis, who was also an anti-war professor and feminist. The Marcus Garvey box on the right-hand side references Marcus Garvey, an activist, journalist, and founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. And he was Jamaican by birth, which is why you see the red, black, and green colors. This is an area in which we were just barely able to scratch the surface. And so, as with everything in this book, we're hoping that people will take this just as a start and will be inspired to undergo research and uncover more and tell additional layers of the story of American jewelry during this period. Of course, we heard that incredible tribute to Nancy Worden earlier this morning. She was no doubt an amazing talent that the world lost too soon. And I had the privilege many years ago of meeting her a few times, even at the occasion of her retrospective at Tacoma Art Museum. Nancy, as you all know, was a strong feminist. She took classes from Ken Corey while she was a high school student. She used found objects because that is what she had easy access to. And it also continued the tradition of Central Washington State aesthetics. Her invitation to create a work in response to a Native American form by Ken Corey is here in this Initiation necklace from 1977. Melding that assignment with her feminism, she used hair curlers as a base material, augmenting some but leaving others pink in a nod to Gloria Steinem. This early work for Nancy conveys her feminism, speaks to issues of fertility, hair, and other aspects tied to being a woman. And it's just one of a number of pieces that we feature by artists in the book that relate to issues of women, women's rights, women's bodies. And Marilee Tompkins, who's also great friends with Nancy Worden, made 2 works in this vein. Many of Tompkins' works, in fact, were overtly sexual, commentating on issues facing women during the time. On the left, you see Snatch Purse with its merkin and other characteristics. It conveys the sexual freedom that women were claiming in the 1970s. And Wild Oats Sewing Kit is a more direct commentary on the sexual revolution. The pill, which you can see a pill pack, a birth control pack that she's used as part of this necklace, and American women who were starting to choose birth control as a way to satisfy their desires without consequences. The yen coin that serves as a lever to move to the next day's pill dose is a pun on the word's meaning of to crave something. And this was typical Marilee to have many layered meanings within her work. That found object tradition of Fred Wohl and the Northwest Jewelers was a huge influence on many artists. And in particular, Bob Ebbendorf speaks to Wohl's influence and the Pacific Northwest. He said their exploration gave him the encouragement to work in this matter. And Bob is a fascinating figure. He was very involved with Snag, but equally involved with the counterculture jewelers. He straddled many, many worlds. He usually did not comment on politics in his jewelry, telling me that some people use their voices to go to Washington, D.C. in March. Some people use their voices at the pulpit and in church, but some people like him use their voices over coffee. In 1967, he made a series of 12 wall pieces that were the only works that he has made to date that explicitly commented on issues of that day. The one I'm showing you here, Pop Explosion, was his commentary on the potential of unchecked birth rates. He was very much in favor of the pill and of women's rights to choose whether or not they wanted to have a family. Sharon Church, an artist who you would not necessarily think of as working in this vein, sort of in the same way as Bob Ebbendorf. She was trained at Skidmore College and the School of American Craftsmen, settles in Philadelphia during this period, and made a series of brooches or pins called Number 2. Sharon was connected to the zero population movement, which argued that increasing population numbers led to society's ills, i.e. violence, pollution, the loss of privacy, etc. The Number 2 referenced the number of children that couples could have without increasing population. Church gave copies of this brooch to friends who shared her ideals. I'm going to end there in the hope that I have whet your appetite, not only for this period, but for a type of jewelry that is not as known within American jewelry history. We hope, as I said, that this book and our research will be a first step, that it will encourage researchers, artists, curators, educators, etc., to dive deeper into this period and the jewelry that was made, especially fleshing out the jewelry made in communities of color. Thank you, Andy, for showing the book. It is, we realize that you all can buy your books anywhere. Please do buy it from an independent bookstore, or even better, at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston's bookstore, so that it will support our programs here. And thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
That was wonderful, Cindy. Thank you so much. I have the book again in front of me, and I'm going to sign it to myself from you, if that works virtually. At any rate, we do have a couple of questions. My understanding earlier in the talk, you kind of were trying to figure out how to define kind of American jewelry, certainly in the period. And I think you came up with this with a found object more so a narrative aspect to it. And I'm curious how you would characterize American jewelry today, because certainly I've heard the Northwest characterized as being narrative, and there's a bunch of metalsmiths in the other room and none of them are narrative makers. So I'm kind of curious how you and Susan and Damien are characterizing this.
Well, I think that the ideas that jewelry artists used, found objects, and that creative narratives is something that continued through the period beyond and continues today in our jewelry. We, for purposes of word count, for being concise and focused, we decided to stop in the first couple of years of the 1980s as a time period to explore. With Snag being formed in 1969 and creating a more codified jewelry community, and then sort of the opposite of that with the counterculture jewelers, we know that artists continued to make incredibly important work that addressed issues of the day. And we had long and hard conversations about jewelry of the 1980s, particularly that dealt with issues of AIDS. And we decided, again, sort of in order to make the book tight, to not try and do a history of American narrative jewelry up to today, because we would only be able to scratch the surface and never go in depth as we were able to. It also felt like in the 1980s, there was a shift in the United States, not only politically, and less sort of the community and counterculture community spirit that we saw in the 60s and 70s, but that jewelry relating to AIDS, opened up, it could be a book unto itself.
Of course.
And I think the same can be said for all of the artists who are working today. Narrative work and found objects are just two pieces of a larger toolkit that jewelry artists reach into and use. They are definitely important ones. But I feel like, and I think I can speak for Susan and Damien, that during the late 60s and 1970s, there was a much more clear split between the jewelry artists in America who were primarily working with metals, who were coming out of more tech and exploring things more technically, who were coming out of a sort of Scandinavian modernist tradition that was being taught in the United States, and that the artists who were using found objects and making narrative work like those in the Pacific Northwest or others that we've highlighted were in some ways marching to the beat of their own drummer. And they found their own community, but it was not necessarily the work or the style that was being taught in most jewelry and metalsmithing programs, apart from some of the ones that we've highlighted in Seattle and Ellensburg and Cal Arts and, CCAC. And, there are others, but I think I hope I've answered the question.
Well, I don't want to put your feet to the fire, but I am kind of curious, really kind of what, just off the cuff, what does, is there something that characterizes American jewelry today?
Today,
Yeah.
That's a tough question, because I think that the field is so well connected today. The dialogue between artists from all over the world is so much more fluid and easier, obviously, because of technology, but also and travel and all of the ways that we can have relationships to images and or the artists themselves.
Sure.
So
Tough one. I know.
I'd have to think further about it, but my gut, and I'm happy for anybody else in the audience to dive in. But my gut is that there isn't necessarily one aspect of jewelry making, whether it's technically or aesthetically or however you want to look at it, that is only happening in America and could be defined as specifically American today.
Yeah, I think it was an unfair question in a way, but it's funny. For so long, I think American smiths have looked to Europe lovingly, a little bit jealously, maybe coveting what's going on over there. And I'm kind of curious. I mean, certainly found object jewelry and found objects have been around. I mean, certainly, Africa, Victorian hair brooches, it's been around for a long time. I'm wondering if there is currently in contemporary work in Europe a use of found objects at all in any significant.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that you see it, all over the world. You see it in Europe, you see it in Australia, you see it in New Zealand, whether it's found natural materials or whether it's, industrial objects, bric-a-brac, et cetera. I think that, that you find it throughout the world, and it can take, and has been during that period. I mean, it can take many different forms, whether it's someone, who in the 80s and 90s, like Tuna Vigeland, who was working with nails, just common nails and pins. It can be as simple as that. There are artists who work with, many artists who work with natural found materials, thinking of people like Dorothea Prull or Warwick Freeman, or I mean, I think, there's a gazillion people that you could talk about in terms of that. And then, found objects also, common objects like Seth Papek back in the United States. But
American, yeah, sure.
there's so
He's a
many.
Seattle boy, by the way. He went to school here, so
Yeah.
gotta give him a plug.
But I think that what we're seeing today is a confluence of the lessons and inspiration from the past. So that's using found objects in a different way. It's exploring form in a different way. It's having more explicit, dramatic narratives that might be more personal rather than
Sure.
ones that are broad. I mean, I feel like in
Like Melanie Bellinker, for instance, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But even
Hair in wax.
even just looking at the works that we saw of Nancy Warden's, her jewelry from the 90s, 80s, 90s and on, they're very often very personal narratives, personal experiences. And I think that jewelry artists are much more willing to put themselves and their own personal, desires, frailties, interests, etc., into their work. Whereas what we were seeing in the 60s and 70s was really about larger political and cultural issues. Their feelings in being anti-war or anti-Nixon or what have you, but it was a different kind of personal statement.
It was a different America. It was a different country.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because, Bob Evendorf, and I should say that so many of these people are still with us, and you can sit down and have a conversation with them, just talking to everybody out there.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob was German trained, right? So he had a very fine goldsmith's aesthetic, and he chose to move in the other direction. What's interesting to me is you've got Bob, making these assemblage pieces, right, of found objects, crab claws, feathers. I heard that he had a whole section in his freezer for squirrel feet.
Yeah.
That's actually true. And but he put them together in kind of this Jungian kind of surrealist way, in that leaving the room for people to make their own associations, right? Which I think was interesting. And then you had Fred Wall, who was just much more specific, in his target of that. And then you had Nancy Warden, which was kind of a blending of the things, because the objects he chose were very charged.
Mm-hmm.
And very specifically charged.
Mm-hmm.
I should also say, not to change subject, but Yuma Symposium is kind of what Summervale kind of became. I mean, those saw file and solder springs are still going on, right?
It was the successor. I mean, Summervale ended in 1984, and Yuma took up the mantle, which is incredible. And Summervale actually just celebrated. There was a celebration of its 50th anniversary of its founding.
Right.
So yes, I mean, Yuma absolutely took up that mantle, which was extremely important for there to be a vehicle, a place for people to come together in a very different kind of way than you would at a ACC conference or a SNAG conference, or
A lot more beer and liquor, I think.
yeah.
Somebody's asking real quick what Yuma is. Yuma is a Yuma Art Symposium. It just celebrated its 40th year. And it is it's the anti-snag, exactly, in the desert in Yuma, Arizona. And really, I don't want to offend anybody, but it's kind of the only reason you're really going to go to Yuma. And it's just a bunch of artists. And what's nice about it is it's involved into a multimedia event. So you have fiber, clay, metals is always going to lead the way because that's what it evolved from. So that's Yuma. I should also say that you're talking to a former second place winner of the Island Ladder Sprints. I just want to toot my own horn, but I got one more question, and then I think we have to start queuing up for the next one. Ellensburg funk. You hear the word funk in music. You hear it. That's funky. You go into the fridge, that smells kind of funky. And then you have Ellensburg funk. So I've tried it. Can you a definition for what funk would be?
So it's a multi-layered definition. The term, when it comes to art, was coined by Peter Sells, a terrific, important curator at Berkeley Art Museum, who did the first and seminal funk exhibition.
What year was that?
That was 1967, I believe. It was an exhibition that focused on ceramics and metal sculpture, a lot of it which was metal. And there's a great quote that I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have it at my fingertips, where he describes funk as being sort of hot and cold. It's a series of opposites. It's hot, cold, it's
repulsive and
attractive. It's scatological. It's funny. It's it's full of satire. And it was a group, really, it was a style that emerged in the San Francisco Bay Area, predominantly out of CCAC and University of San Francisco,
California College of Art and Craft.
Yes. Where artists were working kind of in this vein, and funk artists often took on, particularly in ceramics, took on American tropes and went to town with them. Whether it was Robert Arneson talking about football or various different objects in America. He has his famous toilet series. You can see some at the Seattle Art Museum. I don't know if they're on view right now, but they have
over there.
an amazing collection of Arneson's work from that time. And then there becomes a spiritual and intellectual highway between San Francisco and Seattle. You have artists who were trained in San Francisco, like Ken Corey, for example.
Absolutely.
Or
CCAC.
Howard Kotler is another example from ceramics. And then they return or go to the Pacific Northwest, the Seattle, Ellensburg area, and they're bringing that aesthetic, that spirit, that new challenge to work in that area. So you see funk predominantly in ceramics and fiber. You see it in jewelry.
Sure.
You don't, it's a little too, glass kind of hasn't gotten there yet, although Marvin Lepofsky starts to make some things, but he of course came out of a ceramics tradition. But true funk really kind of dates from that mid to late 1960s through the mid to late 1970s. But it's an aesthetic also in not in ceramics, but in sculpture and certainly in jewelry that takes its cues from assemblage and using found objects. And those traditions continue on today, and funk is a touchstone for artists working in many different media, continuing on.
I was going to say, because it's not distinct from funk and music, certainly, or it's a similar
related.
thing.
The term, Peter Sells used the term as related to music because of a certain kind of experimentation, irreverence, but seriousness. When you listen to funk music, it really, and the artworks, it really does feel
sure
like the soundtrack. It feels this connection, but it's not to say these artists weren't looking to funk music for their cues. It was, but rather Sells from a art historian point of view was able to kind of make the connection
a broader
context. Exactly.
Well, that's awesome. I think of the tuba, of course, as the quintessential funk thing. It's like, whoa, you don't want to ever make that sound, but then again, you want to be able to play to make that sound. Right. And that to me is kind of a quintessential funk.
Yeah, and I should say that there is a chapter in the book just devoted to funk jewelry. Yes, back to the book, of course. But
Of
you
course,
know,
yes.
that is something that the style of funk, the ideas behind funk pervade this period, but we did actually, you know, break it down to a chapter to be able to have all of our readers kind of get a baseline for what funk is and how it emerged during the period.
There were some serious surprises in the book. You know, I mean, Richard Mosley being one of them. I mean, I'm glad that he didn't consider himself a narrative maker, although he did use figurative, you know, heads and faces for a while. And of course, the feast bracelet, I guess, is kind of a quintessential narrative or iconographic kind of thing. We only got a few more minutes, and then we need to get people going for the next one. But I have one more little question. And I mean, what do you suppose started people, you know, let's just say in the 60s, to start using a found object? That what was that connection that they made that said, you know, was there something specific going on that they thought like, huh, you know, it's like fire, like who thought like, well, that's burning my house down, maybe I can use it to cook meat. I mean, there had to be a moment.
Well, I think there's a number of ways to answer that, but I think the most important thing to remember is that these artists were artists not just of the jewelry world, they were artists of the larger art world.
Excellent.
Those of some of them who were embedded in universities as professors were teaching right next to people in all other media. There was a lot of use of found objects, excuse me, and industrial objects or industrial materials during that period in the larger art world. You have someone like Don Tompkins, who's spent serious time in New York at that point, you know, seeing a lot of most up to the moment art. You have other people who I think just were inveterate hunters and gatherers. And so why not, you know, use those materials? Someone like Fred Wall, for example, who, you know, was a consummate metalsmith. Just because these artists worked with found objects didn't mean that they didn't have remarkable metalsmithing skills, because
Absolutely.
they did. So, and then you have people, I think especially the people who were based in the Washington state area, you have these rich indigenous cultures that offer a lot of pathways to be inspired by. And many artists, you know, even though it was harder, had opportunities to travel. You think about Ramona Solberg, who traveled, you know, with the World Crafts Council,
Yeah.
you know, as well as otherwise. You know, many of these artists were traveling on the circuit, and that's why places like Somerville, where you know, it's a place where you can kind of let your hair down, as opposed to some place where you're going to give lectures and demonstrations and, you know, speak to students and such. All of those aspects, you see what other people are doing, and I do think that even continuing today, there are artists who just don't want to metalsmith. They want to work with alternative materials, or in this period, found objects. It's just another aspect of creativity. But the larger art world was very much invested in you know, a return of assemblage and found objects, and narrative ideas, and you know, pop art criticizing consumerism. You know, there was a huge amount of anti-war works being made in photography, and these artists operate as part of the larger world. They're not just looking at jewelry.
Well, that's great. I think we should end there. At some point, I'd love to talk to you about the link between travel and making Ronaho, Ramona Solberg. There's so many people that kind of travel log. But I want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. That was a wonderful lecture, and it's a great conversation. And thanks so much. So for everybody out there,
thank you.
We're going to leave you to take care of whatever assorted business you need to do. And top of the hour, please sign in for Junko Mori, excuse me, which will be the very next one starting at 10 o'clock. So we'll see you very, very soon. Don't forget to sign in. Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you.
You bet.
Bye.